Once upon a time, there was an almost knight. Our hero, a squire, is not yet a knight because the king who was to bestow him with his knighthood was assassinated shortly before the would-be knight's knighting ceremony. But that was a long time ago. And right now, this warrior is sneaking up to a spot where he can observe another young squire fighting to rescue a fair maiden from a magpie that is bigger than a horse. The fair maiden is pinned to the ground by sticks that are stuck through her cloak. The squire kicks away the sticks to free her. The maiden gets up to her feet behind the squire, who continues to face the immense bird. The squire makes a wide swing with his sword, but it misses the bird, and as it continues its arc around behind the squire, hits her neck flesh just barely above her collarbones and only a hair from her spine. Her head flops backwards as if hinged, and she collapses in a bloody heap. Then the bird gives out a huge squawk with a flap of its wings that lifts it up from the ground and appears to strike out towards the man with its feet, but it only hits the air in front of the squire's face. An instant later, the squire sticks out his tongue. It is a grotesque shade of black. It swells to an unnatural size as the young man's eyes bug out in pain and surprise. Then he drops dead too. Our almost knight recalls the image of his king on that fateful night when he died with his tongue in a similar condition. He's bewildered by this development and beats a strategic retreat to reconsider what kind of opponent he must face to recover the jewels that he and the now dead squire were competing to recover, along with the also dead incognito princess. The knight goes to a nun's hermitage located in another part of the mountains. He introduces himself as Reginald, but the nun explains in crude signs that she is observing a traditional day of silence. Therefore, she will not talk to Reginald until the sun sets. So to fill the time, he tells the nun his story. Shortly before he was to be knighted, the good king who was to promote him mysteriously dropped dead. The king's tongue had bloated out and turned black after he had taken a drink during a feast. The kingdom was immediately taken over by the king's lifelong nemesis, who claimed that he had used magic to kill the king. He was known as an evil man, and he took further revenge against the good king by carefully killing all the men who were knighted by him. Thus, Reginald was spared, since he was not yet a knight, and the loyal court recorder had destroyed all the records of the aspirant squires and taken his knowledge of them to his grave. Since the evil king would probably someday find out that an almost knight loyal to the good king had escaped his nefarious plan, Reginald chose to wander from realm to realm, offering his services to desperate kingdoms that did not care that he was not yet a bona fide knight. A recent knightly opportunity for him was in a realm that had lost a princess who was traveling with that kingdom's most valuable treasure, locked in a small carved chest with a single brilliant but small jewel on its top. When the queen of that realm heard of the capture of her daughter and the treasure, she was gravely disappointed. She had personally devised the plan to have the treasure transported by the princess in disguise, with only a few select guards as a way of avoiding the evil king's marauding minions. They were always looking out for opportunities to rape, pillage, or plunder on his behalf. The queen had not anticipated that other forces might foil her plans. The queen reported that the only surviving witness to the taking of the princess was an ancient, reclusive nun who was returning home after her annual pilgrimage to the Shrine of Good Tidings, located in some mountains that formed the border between this kingdom and that of the one usurped by the evil king. That shrine was famous because groups of magpies, which are called tidings, periodically flew in from places unknown and placed small shiny objects on the altar. Several miles from the shrine, the ancient nun had arrived on the scene of the crime, just as an immense magpie carried off the princess and the treasure box. Upon mention of the magpie, the nun turned pale and just barely stopped herself from breaking her ritual vow. Reginald asked her to explain her evident distress at this recounting of her testimony to the queen, but she points out the position of the sun in the sky, refusing, so he continues. When the queen had asked for assistance, Reginald naturally had stepped forward immediately, but so did a young squire of that realm. Each of them realized immediately that a competition was on. Reginald was not familiar enough with the realm to know where to start, so he allowed the young upstart to make the first decisive move to indicate a likely direction. Reginald had a mightier steed and quickly overtook the naive young man. But then, after getting beyond sight, he carefully circled around to follow instead of lead the way. The green warrior led Reginald to the remote shrine of Good Tidings. The squire had correctly guessed that the winged kidnapper might be attracted by the treasure that its smaller kin had deposited there over the years. When Reginald arrived, he hid at the edge of the clearing around the shrine to observe. The first thing he noticed was a magpie bigger than a horse menacing the young warrior. Next, he saw that the princess was pinned to the ground. She was wrapped in her own cape, and several sticks had been poked through it to trap her against the turf. The shrine seemed to be half filled with mounds of small, shiny objects made out of every kind of metal, glass, or sparkling stone. A small chest with a single jewel on top was sitting on the ground outside the main entrance to the shrine, not far from the princess. He saw the squire attack the great bird with his sword, but with a flap of its wings it rose in evasion of the sword, squawked in alarm, and extended its claws toward the squire as if to counterattack. But the gigantic bird misjudged the power of its wing flap and clawed only the air. The princess was accidentally beheaded on the backswing of that attack. Then the younger man dropped dead with a black and bloated tongue. Reginald recalled for the nun how the evil king had claimed to have killed his rival with a magical power that produced that very same result. Since he was not a magician and did not know how to counter magical attacks, he decided to retreat and seek out the nun to get her tale firsthand, just in case some insight into this surprising enemy could be gained. Reginald concludes his tale with how he is planning to use his knightly skills for good and hopes to depose the evil king someday. As the story ends, the sun sets, allowing the ancient nun the opportunity to explain her shocked reaction to the queen's account of her testimony. The queen had reported the nun saw a magpie when she had actually said she saw a dragpie. The nun explains to the warrior that the animal he observed was an extremely rare one because it was the sterile offspring of a dragon and a magpie. There has not been such a beast for hundreds of years, according to the records of her order. The instant death by blackened and bloated tongue was the true indicator, because that was what always happened if the blood of a dragpie got into a person's mouth. Warriors, she says, have a habit of using weapons that not only draw blood, but usually cause it to fly about everywhere as well. And dragpie blood is deadly upon any contact with human flesh. The last dragpie was attacked by a whole platoon and killed all 24 men without striking a single blow. It died a very wildly active and horrendously bloody death. Several of the men died instantly of the bloated tongue that you have seen. On all the others, a pimple instantly arose in each place where even the merest drop of blood touched their flesh. Those pimples turned into a hideous skin rash that spread all over their bodies over the course of the first day. By the second day, the rash had become a rot, and their flesh just fell off until they died completely disfigured. Every one of them was reduced to a skeleton before they could even be buried. Neither the squire nor your king were victims of magic. The king was probably taken by a skilled assassin who was somehow able to get a drop of dragpie blood, and the young warrior by the misfortune of a drop of the toxic blood entering his mouth. My guess is that when the squire you observed committed to his final assault, the bird was quicker than he thought, but his sword must have nicked one of its toes. The young man was undoubtedly shocked to feel the unexpected extra blow behind his back, so he steals a glance to find out and sees the jaw-dropping sight of a headless princess. The bird caws in pain. His attention is brought back to his foe just as the dragpie tries to either counterattack or maybe just shake off the pain. A spray of blood results, a flying drop lands on his tongue. He dies a moment later. Your speculation shows surprising knowledge of weapon craft for a nun, Reginald replies. But I suggest that your jaw-dropping backward glance is not necessary. A young warrior is trained to breathe in through his nose and out through his mouth, thus his mouth likely to be open in any case. Your account of the sword nicking the toe and the beast shaking off the pain tidily explains how the blood got into his mouth to kill him. But alas, the very plausibility and knowledge of the beast that your account provides also puts me, as a warrior, at an unusual disadvantage in my quest to recover the Queen's treasure. Nonetheless, I owe you a debt of gratitude for your insightful counsel. They share a simple meal and conversation before he sleeps on her floor for the night. At first light, he leaves the hermitage and returns to the shrine. Knowing that the dragpie is not magical, Reginald simply waits until the dragpie flies off and quickly approaches the chest. Just before he reaches it, he is spotted by a group of marauders from the evil king's army. Reginald hastily grabs the chest and sets off as fast as he can. His mighty steed eventually outruns the pursuers, but to be safe, Reginald returns to the queen's castle without a stop. He discreetly shows the chest to the first soldier he finds in the capital city, who happens to be more than a mere sentry. They exchange the formalities of noble soldiery to establish that they share in the honor code of their profession. The soldier, a respected junior officer with courtly connections, instructs him to keep the chest hidden in his cloak while they make their way to the palace. Reginald is led directly to an audience chamber where the queen has been performing her weekly judging duties by hearing subject complaints against each other. The soldier bursts in, interrupting the queen herself, and announces that Reginald has news of the princess that must be heard immediately. First, Reginald breaks the news that the princess died by accident at the hands of the brave young warrior, who was also killed by a stroke of bad luck. As the faces of all are falling, Reginald realizes that he has not endeared himself to them, so without waiting for a proper response, he reveals that he has recovered the treasure. With a flourish, he produces the chest from within his cloak. The queen immediately seizes it from him, and as she is putting it down next to her, notices briefly that the hinges are loose, raising a question in her mind. But her immediate concern is the fate of her daughter, so orders the junior officer to clear the room so that she may have a moment alone with her lady-in-waiting. She briefly gives in to the grievous news of her daughter and the would-be savior. As her lady-in-waiting consoles her, she gets her grief under control and asks to be handed the jeweled box. As her attendant grabs the box, the lid opens backwards and unexpectedly without the lock being opened, and a bunch of worthless bits of stone, metal, and glass tumble out of the box as it falls from her fumbling grasp. "That scoundrel!" the queen shouts. This is the end of part 1.